Tonight, we're joined by Dr. Christopher Bellavita. I know him as Bellavita. And in fact, when he signs on, you're going to see his moniker is just Bellavita, because that's how people know him at the Naval Postgraduate School, where he is the director of programs. Interesting background. I'll go through it very, very quickly. He received his PhD from Berkeley, his master's from Berkeley, and his undergraduate from Penn State University. Pretty impressive. But what's most impressive about Chris is his insight. So we're looking forward to speaking to him about leadership, about Homeland Security, and actually whatever comes up. Hey, Pete, how you doing today?
Good. I hope everybody got their seatbelt on for this one. This is going to be a ride.
Yeah,
I know.
Yeah. Should we keep him in a green room or take him out?
We got to take him out at some point, but
okay.
Should we remind the folks what this is all about or what?
Please do.
Well, first of all, welcome everybody to the RF Factor. And the letters RF stand for relentless follow-up. And it's a key factor if you're going to implement a new policy, a new program within an organization. It's the most difficult factor to sustain most of the time, because it involves continuous checks on that rear view mirror up there to see from whence you came, right? In other words, you want to look back to see if your policies and your procedures are still standing. The ones you put in place maybe 6 months ago, a year ago, 5 years ago, are they still in operation, and are they delivering the value that you anticipated that they would? So what we try to do is bring the best leadership minds that we could find, bring them on to our podcast, and tease out what they know about leadership, the concepts, how they were able to positively impact change.
You know, something tells me that we're going to be questioned more than we're going to have conversation. So be prepared.
I didn't study for the exam, but I'm nervous now. I mean, he's a PhD, they like to give you tests.
Well, that insightful mind, I'm already nervous, but let me bring him on here.
Yeah, thank you for that moderately interesting introduction. Your PhD, does stand for piled higher and deeper. So as long as we get that on the table first. So you claim that I have insight. So what do you mean by that? What's an example of that?
Well, Pete, you see this? This is already his
podcast. Already, we're on the defensive. Well, you know what? Let's talk about that.
So let's get over that part of it.
Look, okay, right. Look, okay. So, what do I mean about insight? You're developing a new program. You're developing your Homeland Security program. 9/11 happens. There's all this attention on Homeland Security, and somebody says there ought to be a program. We've got to have something that sort of takes the best minds together and brings out what they know about this, puts the ingredients together to make bread. That's what I think insight is. How do we bring the ingredients together? Which ones do we need? Can we sustain them? And is the bread going to be good at the end of the day?
Okay, I like that. That's a nice metaphor. It comes nowhere near to describing how we created our program at NPS, but I do recognize that as one of the paths of leadership. The notion that there are people who kind of have a sense of what's going on, and they can shape the environment, not control it, but at least shape the environment to get closer to the direction that they want. For us, in starting the Naval Postgraduate School's Center for Homeland Defense and Security, so Ray, that's really distracting that all of a sudden I'm talking to myself on here. If there's a way that I could see
I love it. Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Oh my God.
So
This is good.
it's like I'm looking at a mirror and I'm just gesticulating with, so
Yes, here we go.
no, it's
I'm gonna put my bulletproof vest on for the rest
no,
of this.
it's not. I think I know how to be empathetic. I can, you develop that kind of ability to pretend to be empathetic. So I think what we did was we made up stuff. We did ready, fire, aim. We, rather than spending a lot of time trying to design what is the best Homeland Security program, we just said, hey, this makes sense. Let's do 2 or 3 of these and let's get feedback and see what happens. So the ready, the fire part is just do something. And then the aim is let's have it's kind of a radical feedback loop, but relentless in your phrase, Pete. Whenever we change any of our classes, we have daily feedback on how did it go today? How did it go today? Not knowing what you're doing means you have to have this feedback loop, the OODA loop or whatever it is. So we just made up a lot of stuff and continuing to develop it I think it's called the agile process now, or at least some people call that. We get a 60% solution and we just keep iterating until we get better and better at that. And that's pretty much how.
Well, give us an example. I mean, look, you people sign up to come to this school, or they get selected by their organizations to come, and then you get them into the program. What's the first thing you tell them? What are you doing? They're all sitting in front of you the first day, and how do you explain what you're going to do?
You just got a taste of it, Pete. Right like this. Shout out to the academy.
Well, I think when Guidetti showed up the first day, these are 32 very competent public safety professionals across the disciplines who are not sure if they're smart enough to be in the program, or they think they already know everything that's in here. So somewhere between there are most of the people. So rather than spending a lot of time talking, we just put them into a tabletop exercise immediately and spend the first 2 hours doing that. So, and we make, it may sound silly, but we make them stand up and we make them move chairs around and the tables around so they can form into groups. So they have all this pent up energy, and using it in some kind of physical task and being around strangers and introducing themselves gets all this energy out, so then they can start relating to each other as people. If there is one theme in the podcast, I'll stop there, Pete. Go ahead.
No. Please continue.
You took a breath, and when Italians speak, the first one who takes the breath is defined as the listener.
Well, my question would be to follow up on your train of thought there. At some point now, you've got them moving chairs around. They're doing this tabletop exercise. But then, what's your role then? What are you doing at that point, or at some point?
Yeah, I think I understand the sense. Ray, let's see if you agree with this. We go in there with a very detailed plan. So if everybody were just cogs in a machine, we have something for them to do for the 2 weeks that they're in Monterey. But they're not cogs. They are, they're humans. They're competent professionals. So the metaphor that I use is that we are all jazz musicians. Now, for the class that I'm in, I'll start the themes, but everybody is a talented musician. So what kind of music can we create metaphorically that is based on allowing people, encouraging people, giving them opportunity to bring their talents out? And it really is ready, fire, aim. Theoretically, it's a complexity strategy. We try to create a complex adaptive system where what emerges is something that nobody predicted. So we have boundaries, which are usually 50-minute sessions. Within those boundaries, we have an attractor. So for example, with Ray's session, his first seminar was an intel briefing. And we gave her the intel briefing. If you remember that video, yep. Ray, it was only 30 years ago. Then we asked them some questions based on that. And then we have conversations going around. And then we have the boundaries and the activity or the attractor. And when the conversation is going well, like your podcast, we amplify it. We keep going into territory that we don't know. And when it's not going anywhere, we stomp it and we move on to something else. And so through that process, we create an emergent system. And as long as it's loosely directed, not loosely, it's directed kind of what we want to do, which is our program is about expanding people's ability to be effective leaders in their part of the Homeland Security arena. They come in with leadership potential. We develop that. And so as long as what we're doing is contributing to that mission, we keep going. So each class is different. Each course is different. It's not cookie cutter.
And having said that, and I understand that I'm not challenging that, but at some point there must be some common denominators that start to cut across the various groups for certain ways of thinking or best practices, for example.
I don't understand your question.
There's nothing that cuts across. No, there's no commonalities that you find that if the group fails to identify it for whatever reason or define it perhaps for whatever reason, you would step in and say, what you're doing, we've defined as X, Y, or Z.
I think I understand your question. And what cuts across, we have something called educational skill requirements. The Department of Homeland Security and FEMA did not just say, here's a lot of money, do whatever you want with it. We have educational skill requirements. So the program is built upon our graduates should be able to do certain kinds of things when they leave the program, yes, like critical thinking, like effective research skills, like the ability to collaborate with disciplines outside their own discipline, those kind of things. All our programs have a content dimension, but they also have a process dimension. I think in your book you talk about I think technology and people and processes, and we kind of do that. We have the people and the processes part, and the technology is kind of the tools that we use to run a graduate program. Did that get close to answering your question?
No, more so. It's right on the money. Hey, but I'm going to let Ray ask a couple of questions here.
Well, I do want to go back to Chris, but because we've touched on, or shouldn't touch, we jumped in the deep end of the pool as it relates to CHDS. Chris, you're what, about nearly 15 years out in the program?
Well, 18 years. We started in 2003.
Okay, yes. 18 years out. What do you wish that you would have known then that you know now?
Nothing. I find that to be a not very fruitful activity. I try to continually learn. I try to keep doubt alive, and I'm nervous about being on this podcast. I don't know what the right way is to be on a podcast, so I'm just making stuff up as I'm talking, like conversation.
For the program, though, I'm looking for the program. What did you wish you knew then? After
we are going through a redesign now of our curriculum, and the operating question we have is maybe it came from Guidetti. It was no, it's actually Peter Drucker's question. If we knew then what we know now, would we be doing the same things? And our working hypothesis is probably not. So let's try some new things. But that's at the level of the program. At the level of the individual, I just think give us talented people. Let's put them together and give them interesting questions to talk about. Let's see where that goes. Ray, my sense is that although you sat through the classes and many a days you were actually awake in much of the classes, but it's what happens after the class. It's the colleagues, it's the disagreements, it's the working through. It's always, not always, but it's baffled me that what we do at the Naval Postgraduate School, that could be replicated in New Jersey, that could be replicated in San Diego. You get people who don't normally hang out together, but who still, they share a mission. That maybe they're not really clear about that, but they share, let's say, a public safety mission or an ethos of public service. And you get them together and say, hey, what's going on with you? What's on your agenda these days? And I've heard a number of your guests talking about it's about the people, it's about building the relationships. That's what they did at CHDS. It's what Homeland Security, I think, does more effectively than we did before September 11th, 2001, is it brings people together who normally did not have a way to hang out with each other and say, okay, hang out for 18 months. Now go back home and do this in your community. Why did you make that sound, Ray?
Well, 18 years, you're looking at well over 1,000 people, almost 2,000 people through the program.
Well, we have multiple programs. It's not just the masters. I see the masters as the center of CHDS, but other program leads see their own programs. It's a collaborative, but yeah, with several thousand people.
Each one of them has their own story. Each one of them seems to hail from whether it's a different jurisdiction, a different discipline, and this is sort of that ingredients piece that I found that comes together to create this collaborative environment. I know for me, it sort of changed the way I thought going forward in my own career. But turning back to you, I think you were in a position, and you still are today, you just about know everyone's story that is coming into the program and going through the program, but you have your own story. Where does that start? How did you get from, some beginning somewhere? I know we talked about the Olympics in Utah. How do you get from wherever you started to the Naval Postgraduate School? Can you tell me your story? And I say that because being on the wrong end of you, meaning in the classroom, right?
I know you're being you're being kind when you say that.
I am.
New Jersey kind.
Just like every other student that's gone through NPS, our story. What's your story?
Tell me why that is useful to this podcast so that I know how to shape it.
Well, we have aspiring leaders. Leadership is not something that is, I believe, is a popularity contest. Leadership is something that you have to work for. There is effort that you need to put into becoming a leader, whether it's making sure that you're getting yourself educated, you're engaging in those type of, whether they're assignments or missions that are going to sort of challenge you, move you outside the challenge quo. That happened with you.
Would you entertain the idea that leadership is a myth as a hypothesis?
I'd like to discuss it.
Go ahead.
Yes.
Give us a shot.
And I haven't fully worked this out yet, but listening to the people you've had on your podcast, and then reflecting on that over the weeks, and then going back to the literature, it seems to be something that it's like this magic incantation. And there are various forms of the magic, but once you are bestowed, when you have leadership bestowed upon you, whether you're somebody who's promoted into that position or others defer to you as kind of the informal organization, a variety of ways that one gets that title, then you're expected to somehow to do something different. And that's not really clear. If you look at, there's one of your speakers talked about the thousands of you go on a Google search and look at leadership, and the leadership literature is just all over the place. And there's no evidence that any of the leadership literature or the theories or the schools of thought have done anything else other than make consultants fairly wealthy since the 70s in leadership training programs. I'm unaware of really any measures how it's improved the leadership in our country or in our organizations. We get eaches that we can tie it into, but I just don't see the data for that. So it looks at what are we trying to do, and I think it's trying to put too much pressure in this VUCA world. If you're familiar with that acronym, the VUCA, the world that we live in, that if leaders are in an organization where there's a lot of rules and you follow the rules, that's a different kind of leader, maybe even a manager. But the world that we're in is right now volatile. This is the acronym for VUCA. It's volatile, it's uncertain, it's complex, it's ambiguous. You kind of never know what's going to happen next. And how do you lead in that kind of environment? That's not in the leadership literature a lot. Well, there's some of the leadership literature jumps on that, gives it new names. So it's ignoring, most of the leadership literature that I'm aware of ignores a couple things about it. That leadership is not the property of an individual so much as it's a property of a collective. Who are the people you're trying to lead? Followers matter, as many of your guests have talked about. Why do you care about the people you're supposed to be leading? Because they matter to you. The context, what works for one agency. I think Fernandez had an example of that. What worked in Miami, maybe not so much in the next place that he went to. And you're continually learning. The context changed. the dynamics of what it means to be a leader. My sense is when I've spoken to a lot of leaders who are very effective, and I ask them, okay, so why are you effective? How did you become an effective leader? One of the things that almost all of them have in common is that they are unable to clearly articulate their theory of leadership about why they're effective. It just works. I knew Guidetti when he was a sergeant, and then I knew him when he was a commander. It's still Ray Guidetti. What happened to him that made him be a leader? I think the context and the followers in your organization allowed that part of you, demanded that part of you come out. But it wasn't just you, it was the context in the group that you were in. And just Pete, just looking at some of your career and the stuff that you've done at ATF and elsewhere, I'm guessing it's something similar as well. You are part of a network. It's not so much the individual. So in the same way we call people followers, but in your organizations, the followers, they're like the NCOs. You go to them when you want to lead effectively. They're all around. This notion of being a leader, it's a hypothesis that maybe we're trying to sell people a bill of goods here. I don't know if I believe that or not, but one of the ways that I try to talk with people is, how do I know what I think until I see what I say? So an opportunity like this says, all right, Bellavita, what if leadership were a myth? How would we know that? And how would we disprove that? How could we falsify that assertion that it's a myth? And I don't know those answers. And yes, it often is a conversation stopper at parties too when I bring this up. So.
Well, look, you said it before. If we were talking about management, I think it would be a lot easier to sort of describe that. But when it comes to leadership, I think what always creeps into the conversation is the individual personalities, and that it's different, but it shares something. And we don't know what that something is. We've heard leadership is about inspiring people. It's subjective, that word inspiring. So what you've described, it's resonating with me. Hence the reason why I think it's important to get many perspectives from what we perceive to be leaders, like yourself, like others that have come on the cast, because they're giving a different perspective of this mythical nature of leadership.
So look, I think I'm in the catbird seat here. I've got the professor, and you were a student at the time, and I'm listening to both of you, and the professor says that I throw them in. We have a tabletop. They stand up. We move the chairs around, and they work it out amongst themselves, and they develop this synergy or this learning. So Ray, when this was going on and you were engaged in this tabletop, there must have been somebody saying, let's go right, and somebody else saying, let's go left. And there's somebody or something made the two different diverging opinions come together as one. So what was that? And who was that? I mean,
so are you saying, when was homeostasis reached? That's a good point, Pete, because as you're describing it, that would happen. I mean, particularly you'd have your cohorts and they would be blended together into a plenary. And what I always found in the plenaries was just tremendous disorder or I should say chaos going on with the larger group. But when the cohorts separated, the cohorts had sort of like their own identities. And because they spent more time together as a smaller group.
Like at the bar after class, right?
Very true.
Exactly.
They seem to reach that homeostasis sooner. Now, the divergent opinions, they were still there, but I think people found themselves willing to listen more than they would have if prior to going into this sort of collaborative enterprise. Look, I'll tell you, for me, I prior to that experience, I think I was in law enforcement about maybe 14, 15 years. my friends at that point in my career were cops, and now I was thrown into this much larger melting pot where the acronyms from my organization didn't really fit well with the folks from the Coast Guard or the fire service or the health service. So it forced us all to boil things down to elemental levels that we can have a more fundamental discussion on things, which then also at the same time we're creating trust and bonds among one another. And we found that it was okay to disagree with one another, which is something that I didn't see in my own, going back to my own world in, in, say, the law enforcement community, in the group that I was with. If you disagreed with someone, that's an unpopular place to be. We're here, this dynamic that Chris explained sort of,
it was fostered. It was nurtured.
It fostered it. And it was okay to disagree. It was okay to have conversations. It was okay to be, outside of what everybody else would have thought, because you were given the opportunity to explain yourself.
And Chris,
if on that point, if I understood what your question is, I'm translating it in my own head as where does order come from? If everybody's just doing whatever they want, where does order come from? And that's one of the properties of complexity, that order emerges from the complex adaptive, from multiple agents interacting based on a few rules. And one of the rules is you're going to be civil to each other. Another rule is you're going to take turns in communicating. Another is you're going to act professionally. Another is you're going to bring evidence to bear. There are some rules, and if you use those rules, and we select people who have already demonstrated that they know what it means to be a professional, and they have their own ideas. We're not looking to get rid of their ideas. We're looking for them to share their ideas, and through that process, order emerges. Watch a flock of birds leaving a wire somewhere, and who is the lead bird there? It's that those birds follow some orders. Watch how a city is developed. There's no one that really designs a city, but by following certain rules, an order emerges from that. It's not the only way to organize, because clearly there are rule-based organizations. But my sense is in your task forces in ATF, speculation here, when they worked really well, nobody was ordering. The talented people you had kind of knew what to do. Every now and then somebody might have to come in and kind of recalibrate. But for the most part, when you have good professionals working effectively together, the order is the property of them working with each other.
So did you have these rules, and did you communicate these rules like on the first day when people arrived, or before an exercise? Would you lay out what the rules were so everybody understood that?
No, we let them discover it.
And would you point them out? I mean, if we asked you what were those rules,
several months later, I'd say, because each class is different. At the end of the class, would say, okay, here is what we did here. And then I would go through my complexity theory and the adaptation and the boundaries and amplifying and dampening and those kind of things. And maybe a third of the people bought into it. A third of them thought it was BS. And another third said, I don't really understand what's going on here still. We can't get them all. And I should say that each of our instructors, each of our faculty teaches in a different way. Because I did not grow up in rule-based organizations. I resisted rules. And so I looked for a theoretical perspective that allowed me to do what I wanted within certain boundaries, and trust that came out. And so Guidetti grew up in a rule-based organization, and many of the people in our organization, they want to know, what are the rules to operate effectively in here? And I'd say, make your own. It's the notion of when you're a follower, you look around for somebody to tell you what to do. And then you become a leader because you have ideas about what you want to do. And then as you advance beyond that, you recognize that there are other people, also called leaders, who have ideas about what should be done, and they might not agree with you. So if you're not in a command and control relationship with them, how do you work effectively with other people whose ideas maybe even better than yours? And I think you learn that in a certain stage of your development.
This is a great segue into the notion of relentless follow-up. And I know in the
Oh,
green
please
room,
do. I'm looking forward to this
I
one.
know in the in the green room, we had a little bit of discussion and we figured that we should save it for now. And interestingly enough,
Is that wine he's drinking?
No, this is green tea.
Well, interestingly enough, the way you've just laid that out about in a rules-based organization in the world that Pete came from and I came from, the notion of relentless follow-up was extremely important because you were going back to, in a sense, check on if those rules were being complied to.
It is a synonym for relentless follow-up, nagging.
And nudging, yes.
Nudging is a little different from nagging to me.
I think it's confirming, clarifying, and confirming.
Okay, all right.
So I know you understand because you've heard us with the amount of cast that you've listened to on us. You've heard us repeat this, or you've heard Pete describe it. But I'm wondering if you're questioning it to a degree because is nagging problematic to get?
My wife defines nagging as reminding someone of something you know they haven't forgotten. So I think that there is a balance. I don't understand relentless follow-up.
Okay, so you heard Frank talk about the rape kits.
I did.
So there's a policy, let's say, to test rape kits in a timely manner. And for whatever reason, my butt hurts. I got a headache. I don't have enough money. There's not enough people. The guy is on vacation. Somebody got transferred, whatever. The rape kits aren't getting done.
Yep.
The only reason they found out about that was by accident, and everybody's caught embarrassed and red-handed and has got to fess up to the truth.
Yes.
So relentless follow-up would be that we hold people accountable for agreeing to do what they agreed to do.
I agree completely with that, and I think that there is a category. There's a category of work that takes place in an organization where there are right and wrong answers, and if you know the right answer, like you have to use the test kits, and if you're not doing that, then yes, I think that's appropriate. Hey, the rules are you have to follow up here. I'm not saying no rules. I'm looking at the category of organizational activities that I think what you're talking about is, it's not, because Frank is a leader, but that's a managerial task to make sure are we following the rules.
Okay.
But then look at what an organization does interacting with other organizations in a completely volatile environment where they don't have command and control relationships with those other organizations. What does relentless follow-up mean in that kind of context?
Well, in that context, I would say that, and this is something that in my world often happens because we have police involved that are interdependent upon forensic types to analyze and extract additional information from the preliminary information that's gathered at a crime scene.
Yes.
And so they report to different chains of command at various different levels of government, from state, local, and federal.
Yes.
So my idea of relentless follow-up is that you bring them together before you go to the crime scene. You agree on what the process is. Everybody says, I am in, that's what I'm going to do. And now relentless follow-up is somebody going back and saying, have you done what you said you're going to do? You're going to process this piece of evidence within 24 to 48 hours. Is that really happening? Why am I hearing people come back to me and say, it's been 2 weeks, it's been a month, and I haven't got a report back? And that's what I see. Relentless follow-up is following up on something that everyone agreed to do, and especially when they're from diverse organizations that are required to think and act together in a collaborative way.
That makes sense to me, what you just described. When you were working with Michelle Murza, is that how you pronounce her last name?
Yes, Mordeza.
So were you I mean, did you use the same logic?
Of course. I mean,
How so?
yeah.
Can you describe that? You had no control over her or the appropriations committee. You could only influence it.
Exactly. But once they agreed to do something, and I agreed to do something, I held myself responsible to do it, and they too. But let's say that something was to give to appropriate a certain amount of funds to ATF
Yes.
for a certain reason. At some point, they held us accountable at the next appropriations hearing. They wanted the director to say what he was, a he at the time. There was no she at that time. What he did with that money they gave him for that purpose.
Okay, that makes sense to me.
And that's the follow-up.
You have helped me understand that concept.
Can I also describe it this way? Harkening back to my NPS days, Bloom's taxonomy was something I learned from the get-go, entry into the program. I have since come to favor that sort of that framework of understanding learning, understanding evolution of someone's skill sets. When you look at Bloom's taxonomy, there's a piece in there, right? Evaluation. I find that the relentless follow-up, while when CompStat was being developed, it probably didn't sound cool to use the word evaluation, so it was relentless follow-up. But where I identify relentless follow-up is Bloom's taxonomy, the evaluation piece. And I find it to be the most difficult for whether it's leaders, whether it's change agents, policy folks that have a vision, folks that are coming into an organization and talk about the change they want to make, the implementing the assortment of programs, because at the level of the folks are in an organization where they're now have the ability to implement change, implement programs, it's usually not just one thing.
I'm losing track of what you're telling me, right?
The evaluation piece is necessary because if at a high level in organization, you're not just working on one program that you're implementing. It's usually several. So if you're not, okay. If Pete's metaphor of looking in the rearview mirror, I've been around plenty of leaders, ranking commanders. They talk about where they want to go, but they never go back and follow up. They never do the evaluation to make sure any of that stuff.
And mission accomplished. You find that not unusual in your professional experience, both
It's not unusual. Hence the reason where CompStat had that piece in there of relentless follow-up. If you want to make sure things are, what gets measured gets done, Peter Drucker. If you want to make sure it gets done, you better measure it. That's relentless follow-up.
What about stuff that you can't measure?
Like prevention, like Homeland Security?
Or no, I'm thinking of if people are important, how do you develop an authentic relationship with the people that you're with in a hierarchical setting when you have a formal authority over them, but you also recognize their value of human beings, and sometimes you have to break the rules. Sometimes equity means you treat people differently based on their situation, not necessarily the same. Those tough things that you have to deal with.
Well, you ensure that you bring them together to think and act together with you, so they see themselves in what they're trying to do. If they don't recognize themselves, they don't recognize their input. If they don't see that they're involved in this in the main purpose of this organization, they won't be.
Yeah.
And I think what Pete is describing is empowerment. At a high level in an organization, you're not going to be able to spearhead every initiative. But what you can do is lay out a vision, lay out a roadmap, and inspire people and allow them to go out and conduct this work, right?
So that to me sounds like a bucket full of cliches, that you want to inspire people, give them a vision, empower people. That we've had that language at least since the 70s. How are we doing with that? What's your assessment of the quality of you've all spent a lot of time in the professions, the quality of leadership across the board now in public service, in public sector, in law enforcement now compared to any time in your career? How would you measure that or even assess it intuitively?
Well, I would look, usually when a program doesn't sustain, when it doesn't deliver the benefits that you anticipated over the period of time that you anticipated, it's usually a question of the people aren't getting feedback. The people never were included. They never saw themselves in this. They agreed to do it because they wanted to be cooperative rather than collaborative with you.
Pete, my apologies. I didn't ask the question correctly. I'm looking for your assessment across the country, law enforcement leadership, not a particular agency, but how would you assess the quality of law enforcement leadership? Police are under attack all over this country. What kind of leadership do you see out there that you would hold up as models for what other departments should emulate? I know there are a lot of departments, but just in general, in your observation of that discipline.
Well, there certainly are departments that we could identify that are models. At the risk of leaving one out, I'm hesitant to.
Okay, there's an example of leadership right there.
Yeah, but no, seriously. I mean, when you look at the certain years in NYPD, when you look at Boston, certain years in Boston, the problem is sustaining the good things, where a lot of departments have had years of heydays. Boston had ceasefire back in the early 90s, and it was a very effective program. It was measured by academics whom I know and trust very much. But what happened is, as people succeeded through the roles of leadership within that organization, it somehow didn't get important to them.
What I like about what you just said is that it illustrates, at least for me, what works at one particular time is not guaranteed. Okay, so we can check this box off. We always know about how to motivate people. The example that Chuck Ramsey uses for CompStat is, for a lot of years, CompStat was exactly the right thing for New York City to use to reduce the crime rate, but they never knew when to stop it. And so then the bad part of that system started getting into play, not just with the citizens in New York, but also inside the department. So when does a leader know that that's not fair, but the tactic that I use that get me this success, when is it time to give that up and get something new?
When you ask the question, when you bring everybody together routinely and say what's working and what's not, and let's keep doing what's working and let's fix what's not, or stop doing it.
As you said earlier, I'm too busy working to reflect on it and to do that feedback cycle. You're right; it's needed.
We're always too. When I was a cop years ago in Connecticut, and when I would go into the record room to pull a record, there was a sign hanging on the wall, and I'll never forget this sign. And it said, "How come there's never enough time to do it right the first time, but there's always enough time to do it over again?" Yeah. And like, I mean, that says it all, really.
It's so true. And why is that? Why is it that it's not done right the first time?
I'm too busy. I got a headache. I don't have enough people. I got
too much to do.
Exactly.
I'm just going to let this go. I'll get sloppy. So anyway, this is an example of what we do at the Naval Postgraduate School.
Well, we know, Bellavita, we know you're playing us, and this was a great exercise.
It's not the playing. It's around how do you get information out of knowledgeable people? Is you have a conversation. We had who was controlling this conversation? Where did the order come from? We just kind of know when we're talking with each other when to bring up an example, when to stop, when to shift. It just is inherent in us as one of our attributes. I think at senior leadership levels. How do we
sign me up, Coach? I'm in. You got me.
And look, Chris, you pointed out, hence the reason, like one of the major underpinnings of why Pete and I opted to jump into the RF factor is because I think to your point is that it's sort of a roll of dice around the country. That it's so dependent on maybe the organization at a given moment in time. It's dependent on the individual at a given moment in time. Is there any way we could correct that? Is there any way we could insert ourselves in there to try to develop that homeostasis?
Tell me what you mean by homeostasis. I think I understand, but I may be using the word differently from you.
I'm too embarrassed to ask.
Well, bringing out that balance that you're describing, right?
Oh.
We've had a conversation here, the three of us. I think, Pete and I were looking at this particularly relentless follow-up from one lens. And it wasn't until you provided your insight for us to question ourselves and say, well, look, I'm still, wedded to relentless follow-up, but now I have I have another perspective that I need to consider when I'm having conversations with
contextual
people.
Perspective.
Yes,
Exactly.
contextually.
Yeah, and so do I as well. I think it's a concept that's worth exploring. I mean, in my own work, so I benefit from it as well. I think, Ray, for your question, I think we have 50 states. We have laboratories of democracy, as one of the Supreme Court justices said, and we have local control of law enforcement. We have all these experiments going on there. How does law enforcement deal with the current turmoil that they're in? I don't know. Is it IACP's job to follow that? Is it Major Cities Chief? Who is looking at this to see what we can learn from these multiple experiments that are going on across the country?
These are questions.
Where does the buck stop?
Yeah,
if it
these
stops
questions,
anywhere.
These questions are they're being discussed in so many little enclaves all over. Nobody has those answers yet, right? But I think the more that discussion takes place, is that those answers are going to percolate to the top. They're going to have to.
I hope so. I have trust that they will come up from the bottom. They won't be edicts from the White House or from Congress. Things will work in communities, and police are smart enough to say, hey, this worked over here in a community that's roughly like ours. Let's try that this way. I see one of the benefits of our program is we get a lot of police officers in there, and each of their communities does policing a different way. We can learn from that.
Right.
I think what you've just touched upon is the benefits of your program, bringing in not only police, but as you said before, it brings people in from different perspectives. Coast Guard, it brings people in that have relevance to the subject, like perhaps Michelle Mordeza, who was the committee the committee chair
Chief of Staff.
Exactly, for the appropriations committee that funded law enforcement agencies. So we want her perspective. We want her in that group. We want some academics in the group. We perhaps doctors that could tell us what happens to the physiology of people when you put a chokehold on them. I think that your method is probably the one that is going to find the answer, or else, like Ray says, with so many people talking and writing and blah, 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 the answer will come someday. But when? Are we going to wait years before it all comes together? Or can we use a program like yours to speed this up a bit in the right
Chris,
way?
And then how do you make it scalable? I mean, there's 800,000 law enforcement officers in the United States.
18,000
agencies. I was fortunate enough to go through the NPS experiment, along with another almost 2,000 people with all its programs. But that's still not scalable enough, right? To bring all these diverse set of agencies. I don't know what the answer is to do that, but we're certainly going to have to think about it.
I'm not a fan of answers in the sense that I think we're using that in that, okay, that issue's done. Let's move on to something else. I think what we were talking about are in the literature, wicked problems that it's really not clear what the definition of the problem is, but we kind of have a sense of it, and we'll help we'll push the can down the road a little bit. We'll help manage the problem and maybe mitigate some of the negative impacts of that. Climate change is one of them. Immigration is another one. There's lots of them in policing, public health, and so on. I think what we do is, again, back to our mission, which is to educate people, to help educate people, to be effective as leaders in their part of the Homeland Security enterprise. And what that means as a leader is somebody will run for office, but it also means somebody gets into their network and starts bringing fire and public health and emergency management into their fusion centers, for example, and let's see what they can contribute. That's one of the things. There have been some benefits that I can't say benefits, but we have learned some things organizationally through the COVID continuing emergency about the role of different agencies and different types of intelligence, public health intelligence, for example, using medical doctors as a part of the public safety enterprise that we didn't know before this. So we can't. It's like our program. We can expose people to certain ideas, but it's more, we don't teach people things, they learn things. And the proof to me is learning is when you can transform an experience into knowledge. And so they go back home and they have more experiences. And as Ray suggested, you look at what happened in a different way before, because you have more concepts, you have more ideas. Maybe you can remember the voice of the firefighter. It said, yeah, we would like to know what are in those buildings in your cities, because maybe we can help out. And I think we expose people to the ideas of what learning as an adult means, and that it's a lifelong activity, and then give some methods to do that and hope that they're able to do that when they get back home.
We're in, man. I thought this is probably the most interactive podcast that we've had. Is certainly the most enjoyable.
Okay, so why is that? Why aren't they all like this?
Because we had the leader telling us how they led, and you made us learn and explain what we were doing.
You also knew a lot about. I mean, you had history with just about everybody you brought in, and I found them. You were able to ask them questions to pull out what I thought were insightful interviews.
And you asked us the questions this time. Right. Yes. You turned the tables on us.
Well, I don't mean to turn the tables.
No. I say that in a good way.
Good.
There's that insight. There's that introspection that I told you. What I got from the program is just, this is a reminder of it, is forcing yourself. You just can't, it's not about your opinion anymore. It's not about what you're thinking as much as, you have to consider your audience. You have to consider what you're saying, how it's going to be received, and be able to argue that. What I've watched early on, and I got to see this even when I was when I graduated, and I would sometimes come back and visit and watch you that first day where the cohort is in front of you, and when the students that held their own and were able to argue their point, you could see there was like a win that took place, not only for yes. them, but for you to recognize, hey, look, there's no right or wrong answer here. I need to know why you're saying what you're saying. It's just not a hackneyed expression I'm looking for.
I like the notion of it's a win. It's a win when I think, let's take the notion of the relentless follow-up. I think my understanding of that has been improved through this conversation. I don't think either of us or any of the three of us won that discussion. I think we all won that discussion. And how can you have conversations with people about issues that you all care about, where having the conversation is a win for everybody, in that sense? But that I don't think is idealistic. We're a lot of times arguments are who won, who lost, but how do we expand what we know about the concept through our discussions? That's what I liked about that part of the conversation.
Pete, I'll let you ask one final question.
Machiavelli, in this book, The Prince, asked if it was better to be loved or feared. What would you say if I asked you that question?
I would say I would say yes. I would. Give me a situation, and I'll tell you if I have to be loved in that one or feared.
So you're going to say it's in the context of the situation.
Well, I think so.
When would the prince be safer, if he was loved or feared? What would enhance his safety?
I think if you're a leader, I think you have to abandon the notion of being safe. I think then you go back to being a manager. I'm not trying to be argumentative here. I think in the hypothetical, it's not uneasy lies the head that wears the crown, some British guy wrote. I think that it goes with the territory. I think if you're going to be an effective leader, you have to think about losing your job. And as many of your guests have said, doing the right thing is the motivator. And if the right thing is to be feared, I don't think I'm a person that frightens people. And so I don't really have that experience, but it's a lot easier, I think, to find out what do we have in common and how do we build something positive about what we have in common. I don't want you to be just like me.
Fair enough.
Well,
Doc. Wait a minute. So if you were to ask me a question, Pete, that you hadn't asked other guests, what would that be?
I'm going to go back to the rules that you said that you had in your program. I'd like to know what they are. I mean, are they consistently shared at some point during the thing? In other words, do you go back at night and say, did I cover all these things before I let this crew out of here? Or
yeah, what do you think? When we first started, we had a one-page policy manuals. Don't be an asshole. And then now I think our policy manual is about 70 pages.
Okay.
All of them generated by somebody not meeting up to the prime directive.
Go figure. Yes.
I may be exaggerating a little bit from that.
Yeah, I get it.
We bring in people who have already been socialized by rules. And so we just ask them to act professionally. They are grown-ups who are in graduate school, for crying out loud. And so they're strongly motivated to be in graduate school. And they're a delightful group of people to work with. They're there not because they have to. It's not a training program. They have to compete to get in. And that energy allows us to work with them as adults.
And the atmosphere that you provide allows people to agree to disagree in a professional way.
I hope so, yes. And for that to work, we have to bring in a variety of people. It can't all be police or firefighters.
Got it.
Eddie, you get one question.
I tried to ask you the question.
What was the question?
I wanted to know your story, and you wouldn't tell me.
It's not that I wouldn't tell you. I wanted to know why you wanted to know that, and I didn't get a good answer to that. I mean, how was it contributing to this conversation? And I thought it led to whatever we did talk about.
You're true.
So what book are you giving to people these days, Ray?
Oh boy.
You should watch your own podcasts, you know. Oh, Boyd.
Yeah, this is my favorite. You brought him up before, the OODA loop. This, the notion of, do you want to be something or do you want to do something is the key here, right?
Yes. You can learn a lot from lieutenant colonels, I believe. There's a reason why they didn't become colonels. He was able to keep his internal integrity, I think, and still be an Air Force officer.
Absolutely.
But at a cost. At
a cost.
Yeah.
Good point.
What are you reading now, Pete?
I'm reading. I don't want Ray to know.
Okay.
You want me to hold on?
No, I'm reading Peril. I've just finished Thunderdog.
I don't know either of those books. Can you enlighten me?
Peril is the book by Bob Woodward, the one that just came out.
Yes,
about that guy that used to be president.
Yeah.
And Thunderdog is about the man that whose seeing eye dog led him and a bunch of folks down from, I think, the 60th floor or 78th floor of the Trade Center.
You're kidding.
And yet, no. And he was blind, and his seeing eye dog led him down the stairs, and he talks about how that happened. And then I've just finished You paint you paint houses, don't you? About Jimmy Hoffa.
I heard that story. That's wonderful.
Okay. How about you?
Oh, well, so I was prepared for was the question
is that your ringing? Yes.
My
ringing? Wind chimes? Somebody's got wind chimes on.
I don't have wind chimes.
Okay.
I don't have wind chimes. I think maybe it's time for you to rest.
What is that?
I don't know.
I was prepared for the question of what are you reading now, which you didn't ask me, but you asked others. So the answer is a lot of stuff. But what I would talk about is not so much what I'm reading, but how I'm reading. It's a technique that I learned from the author Yuval Harari, who is he's an Israeli historian who's written a number of books. The most recent one is 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. He's a prodigious reader. And what he does is he'll read the first couple chapters of a book. And if he hasn't learned anything by the second or third chapter, then he'll put the book away and move on to something else. Combine that with Kindle, allowing you to download the first chapter of many books for no cost. You can read a boatload of stuff to get a sense of, okay, do I want to go out and buy this book?
Pete, I told you he's a smart man.
I'm a smart, my knowledge is, I know a lot of things, but they're really thin. If you probe me, the knowledge doesn't go down very deeply. One of the things that I've learned from Naval Postgraduate School is how much intelligence there is in the world if I just shut up and listen to it.
Wow.
Oh, that's a great way to end this, right?
Certainly is. That was perfect.
You're welcome.
Hey, Doc, I can't thank you enough for coming on. It was entertaining, it was challenging, and it was certainly informative.
Edutainment is the word for what we did, I think. That's nice to meet both of you. Thank you for doing this podcast. And I didn't know about the other one. I will spend some time watching that as well. I'm glad you're getting people and giving them the forum to think out loud with you.
Thank you.
Have a good evening, both of you.
Be safe, sir. Seatbelt or what? Holy mackerel. Oh, you're on mute. You're on mute, pal. Look at you.
Yeah, that's because my wife is chopping something in the other room. I didn't want to have a chop on the thing.
Wow. She's yelling at you now?
Yeah, she's yelling at me. No, that was great. That was great. I love the way he challenged us. And I think that there were a lot of lessons learned for folks. It's a whole new way of looking at the whole subject we're talking about on our RF factor.
Well, I was concerned about telling you because I knew he would do that. I was concerned how you might prepare for it or even react to it.
Ray, I bought guns from Morris Von Campbell. Come on.
That is true. But you have to experience the Bellavita. And you can only imagine experiencing
the good life.
That. Well, it's incredible, right? It really forces you to think through things during your conversation.
No, you're right.
And it's uncomfortable. You're outside your comfort zone, but that's where you're learning.
I learned a lot, and I think the people that watch this are going to learn a lot.
Yeah.
Everybody we have on brings a different dimension, and so I think that this was an important one that I'm glad we had.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, my friend, you be safe, and I'll talk to you soon enough.
All right, I'm going to go eat dinner.
Okay.